Fatal family secret. The woman who ignored her husband's dark past. Criminal story. Rebecca Hartley had always considered herself lucky. Her life with John, her husband of 12 years, was something many would envy. They had a beautiful home in a quiet suburban neighborhood, 2 children, Emma and Jack, and a life that seemed filled with everything she could have ever hoped for. She often thought of their life as a perfect balance: the routine, the stability, the mundane joys of family life. Her days followed a comfortable rhythm, with little interruption, and she had grown to appreciate the predictability of it all. Before we can continue, if you love crime stories, subscribe to this channel to help up creating amazing stories. Now, let's continue. John worked as a mid-level manager in a corporate firm. His hours were long, but he was good at his job, respected by his colleagues, and never once had Rebecca questioned his commitment to their family. After all, he always came home at the same hour, and when he did, there was always a smile on his face, tired but content. Dinner was always served promptly, and the children's activities were never overlooked. Their life, as she saw it, was harmonious, and there was nothing more she could ask for. In a way, she had come to take for granted that life would remain exactly the way it was. She and John had met in their 20s at a small gathering hosted by mutual friends. Rebecca had been immediately drawn to his calm, understated demeanor. Where many men were loud and boisterous, John was quiet, reserved. Some might have called him boring. But Rebecca found comfort in his steadiness. They had fallen in love quickly, marrying within 2 years of meeting each other. It had always been a simple love, no fireworks, no great drama. But it was real. At least she thought it was. Her friends would often marvel at their relationship. "You two are so lucky," they would say. "You've got it all figured out." And for the most part, Rebecca agreed. She was satisfied, maybe even content with the life they shared. It wasn't flashy or grandiose, but it was theirs, and that was enough for her. The challenges they faced, like balancing work, raising children, or maintaining a home, felt like small hiccups in the grand scheme of things. Nothing out of the ordinary. Nothing they couldn't handle. But despite all this, there was always something missing. Something unspoken in the air that Rebecca couldn't put her finger on. It wasn't a feeling of dissatisfaction exactly. It was more like a faint whisper that crept into her mind during quiet moments. Occasionally, she would catch herself looking at John across the dinner table, wondering if he was really the man she thought he was. It was a fleeting thought, easily dismissed, but it lingered in the back of her mind like an echo. Perhaps it was just the monotony of life settling in, the lull that comes when 2 people are comfortable and familiar with one another. It was on a Saturday afternoon that the first crack appeared in their perfect life. Rebecca had taken it upon herself to clean the attic, a place that hadn't been touched in years. Boxes of old family photos, forgotten keepsakes, and the detritus of their past had accumulated there, waiting to be sorted. She found it therapeutic, almost meditative, to go through these old memories. As she sorted through old pictures, letters, and trinkets, she stumbled upon an old newspaper clipping that caught her eye. It was tucked inside an envelope, yellowed with age. The headline, boldly printed, read, "Murder suspect still on the loose after 20 years." For a moment, Rebecca simply stared at the headline, trying to make sense of what she was reading. Her fingers trembled slightly as she read on, her eyes moving down the page. The article described a murder that had shocked the small town where it occurred. A young woman found dead in her apartment, the victim of a brutal stabbing. The police had investigated but had been unable to find the killer, and the case went cold. But there was one name that stood out on the page. The suspect was a man named John Hartley. Rebecca's heart skipped a beat.
John.
Her husband. At first, she thought it must have been a different John Hartley. There were plenty of people with that name, after all. But as she scanned the article, she saw that the description of the suspect matched the details she knew about her husband. A young man, about the same age as John had been at the time, living in a nearby town. She felt a cold shiver run down her spine. This couldn't be happening. There must have been some mistake. Her mind raced as she tried to make sense of the words on the page. How could this be? How could her husband, the man she had trusted with her life, the father of her children, be connected to something so horrific? She thought back to their years together. Her memories of him were filled with kindness, love, and unwavering support. He had never once shown any signs of violence or rage. But this article, this undeniable piece of evidence, made her wonder, was it possible that John had been hiding something from her all these years? Her thoughts began to spiral. She remembered the way he had always been somewhat secretive about his past. He rarely talked about his life before they met, and when he did, it was always in vague, unremarkable terms. He'd been in a few minor scrapes with the law when he was younger, but nothing serious. Nothing like this. She had never pressed him for details, trusting that the man he was now was the only version that mattered. But now, as she read those chilling words, she couldn't help but feel as if something had been concealed from her. Rebecca couldn't think clearly. She wasn't sure if she should be angry, terrified, or simply confused. She looked at the newspaper article again, hoping that maybe, just maybe, there had been a mistake. But the more she read, the more certain she became that this wasn't some random coincidence. This was real. Her husband had been involved in a murder case, a case that had never been solved. The man she had spent over a decade with, the man who had been a loving father and husband, had been a fugitive at one point in his life. The silence in the attic felt oppressive. Her heart beat loudly in her chest as she placed the newspaper clipping down on the floor beside her, her hands shaking. She couldn't breathe. She thought of the life they had built together, the trust they had shared, and the family they had raised. How could this have happened? What did this mean for their future? Rebecca knew she couldn't let this go. She had to confront John. She had to know the truth. But as she stared at the newspaper, doubt crept in. What if she was wrong? What if this was a misunderstanding? But no matter how much she tried to rationalize it, she couldn't shake the unease growing in her chest. It took her nearly an hour before she could bring herself to go downstairs and face him. John was in the living room, as usual, reading the newspaper. He didn't look up when she entered, and for a moment, she stood there, paralyzed by the weight of her decision. She had never imagined herself in this position, not in a million years. When she finally spoke, her voice was shaky. "John, we need to talk." He glanced up, his expression calm but curious. "What's wrong, honey?" he asked. Rebecca felt a wave of emotion well up inside her, but she forced herself to speak the words she had been dreading. "I found something today. A newspaper article from 20 years ago. It says you were a suspect in a murder case." John froze. His face drained of color as his eyes met hers, and for a moment, Rebecca saw something she had never seen before. Fear. Pure, unmasked fear. He didn't say anything. Instead, he stood up and walked over to her, as if to take the paper from her hands, but she held it firmly. She wasn't ready to let go of this piece of the puzzle, just yet. "Rebecca, please," he said softly. "It's not what you think." But the words were already out in the open, and the truth was hanging between them like a heavy weight. Rebecca had to know what he was hiding. The man she thought she knew was slipping away from her, and she was scared. Scared of what she might uncover. Scared of what this meant for their future. Rebecca stood in the living room, the newspaper clipping still in her hand, staring at John, her heart racing. The calm, collected man she had known for over a decade now seemed to tremble under her gaze. She felt a strange mix of disbelief and horror swirl within her chest, making it hard to breathe. The paper in her hand, bearing the name of a murder suspect who was eerily familiar, had shattered everything she thought she knew about her husband. The life they had built, the love they had shared, now felt like a fragile house of cards, about to collapse under the weight of a terrible secret. John's face was pale, his usually confident demeanor replaced by a look of utter panic. He shifted uneasily, his gaze avoiding hers, his hands nervously clenching and unclenching. Rebecca's mind raced as she tried to process what she had just uncovered. She had thought they shared everything, every part of themselves, every detail of their pasts. And yet, in the dark corners of their life together, something was hidden, something far darker than she could have imagined. She took a deep breath and broke the silence, her voice trembling. "John, why didn't you tell me about this? Why didn't you tell me the truth?" The words felt like they were tearing at her insides, the anger and hurt mingling with a growing sense of betrayal. She had trusted him, loved him, believed in their future together, and now she felt foolish for never having questioned his past. John's eyes flickered toward the floor, and for a moment, he said nothing. He looked older in that instant, burdened by something heavy. "Rebecca," he finally said, his voice strained. It wasn't supposed to be like this." His words hung in the air between them, offering no real explanation. Rebecca's heart thudded painfully in her chest. She could feel the edges of her mind fraying, overwhelmed by the sheer impossibility of what she was hearing. "What do you mean, John? How could something like this have been hidden from me for so long?" John moved toward her, his steps hesitant, as though he feared that any sudden movement might make the situation even worse. He placed a hand gently on her arm, but she pulled away instinctively, the touch feeling foreign to her now. "I didn't want you to know. I never wanted you to find out. It's in the past, Rebecca. The past. It doesn't define who I am now." His words were soft but filled with urgency, like a man pleading for forgiveness even before he could fully explain. "Then explain it to me," Rebecca demanded, her voice rising, a sharp edge of panic in her tone. "How could you have kept something like this from me? We've been together for over a decade, John. How could you hide something so important?" John seemed to hesitate, his gaze shifting between the floor and her face. The unease in his eyes was palpable. He ran a hand through his hair, as if searching for the right words that would make everything make sense again. "Rebecca, I was young and stupid. It was a mistake, a horrible mistake. But I didn't do it. I swear to you, I didn't. I ran because I was scared. I was a kid, and I didn't know how to handle the situation. I wasn't even in town when the murder happened. But it didn't matter. They thought I did it." Rebecca stood there, her mind in turmoil, trying to reconcile the man she had married with the person standing before her. She could see the pain in his eyes, but it did nothing to ease the gnawing fear in her stomach. She needed more. She needed to know the whole truth, not just fragments of a story that only raised more questions. "I don't understand," she whispered, barely able to speak. "Why didn't you tell me any of this before? Why didn't you say something when we first met? When we got married?" John swallowed hard, and for the first time, he seemed completely vulnerable, like a man whose secrets had finally caught up with him. He glanced toward the kitchen as if he might escape, but then his gaze returned to her. "I was afraid, Rebecca. I was ashamed. I didn't want you to think I was some kind of monster. And I didn't want to lose you. You were everything to me. I thought if I kept it buried, we could have a normal life, a clean life." Rebecca's chest tightened as she tried to absorb his words. He had kept this secret for so long, kept it from her, from their children, from the people they interacted with every day. The realization hit her like a tidal wave, and she struggled to stay grounded. She had spent years loving a man who had never been fully honest with her. The foundation of their relationship, built on trust, now felt fragile, as though it could collapse at any moment. Rebecca's voice cracked, and she stopped, choking on her own words. "I don't know what to believe anymore." Her knees felt weak, and she sank into the couch, her hands trembling as she held the newspaper clipping. The weight of the situation, the complexity of it all, made it difficult to think clearly. How could she simply turn away from this? How could she just forgive him, move forward, knowing that this dark chapter of his past was hanging over them? John stood frozen, watching her, his face filled with a mixture of sorrow and fear. "I never wanted to hurt you. I swear. I was just trying to put it behind me, to move on. I didn't want to bring it into our life. But now it's out, and I can't undo it." Rebecca took a deep breath, trying to compose herself, but the emotions she had been holding in for so long began to spill over. "How long have you been hiding this, John? When did you decide to keep this from me?" And all this time, all these years, she shook her head in disbelief, her mind flashing back to all the moments they had shared, the intimate conversations, the plans they had made for the future. How could she have been so blind? I don't know, he said softly, stepping closer to her. I don't know how it happened. I never planned it. I never wanted to hurt you. It just became easier to lie, easier to pretend. I thought if I kept quiet about it, it would stay in the past. But it never did. And now you know.
I'm sorry, Rebecca.
I never wanted to put you in this position. Rebecca's heart ached as she looked up at him. His voice was filled with guilt, but that didn't erase the fact that she had been deceived. The revelation didn't just shake the core of their relationship, it shattered it. There were too many unanswered questions, too many details left unexplained. Could she ever trust him again? Could she reconcile this dark truth with the man she had built a life with? She felt a surge of anger flood her chest, a heat that burned through the fog of confusion. You should have told me, she said, her voice shaking with a mixture of frustration and pain. I had a right to know, John. I had a right to know who you really were. We had a right to face this together. I can't believe you kept this from me all these years. I know, he replied softly, his voice filled with regret. And I'm so sorry. I didn't think it would come to this. But now that it has, I will do whatever it takes to make it right. Please, Rebecca, please don't leave me. His words were desperate now, his emotions raw and unfiltered. Rebecca's chest tightened as she struggled to process what she was feeling. She couldn't make sense of any of it. The man she had loved and trusted was now a stranger in so many ways. The truth, so jagged and painful, had broken the illusion of the life they had built together. Could she forgive him? Could she find a way to move past this? Or was it too late for any of that? For the longest time, they both sat in silence, the air between them thick with unspoken words. Rebecca's mind raced, torn between a desire for clarity and an overwhelming sense of betrayal. What would it mean for their family? What would it mean for their future? Would they be able to rebuild the life they had? Or would this secret forever poison everything? Finally, Rebecca broke the silence. I need time, John. I need time to think. I need to understand what this means. I need to figure out if I can live with this with you. Her voice was quiet but firm. John nodded, his face filled with sorrow and understanding. He knew that words alone couldn't fix what had been broken. He had never expected forgiveness to come easily, and now, as he saw the pain in Rebecca's eyes, he realized just how much damage he had caused. I'll give you all the time you need. I'll do whatever it takes. I'll prove to you that I'm not the man I was then. Please, Rebecca, don't give up on me. Rebecca stood up slowly, her legs weak, her mind a whirlwind of emotions. She didn't know what the future would hold, but one thing was certain. Their life had irrevocably changed. And the truth, no matter. Rebecca spent the next few days in a haze, drifting between disbelief, anger, and numbness. Her thoughts were constantly consumed by what she had learned about John's past, his connection to a brutal murder investigation, a past he had hidden from her for over a decade. She could hardly look at him without feeling a growing sense of betrayal. Even when he tried to reach out, trying to explain or comfort her, she pulled away, unsure of what to believe anymore. The trust that had once felt so solid and unshakable had now crumbled, leaving behind a shaky foundation that threatened to collapse with every new thought. For the first time in their marriage, Rebecca found herself questioning everything she had known about John. How could the man she had loved and trusted for so long have kept something this monumental a secret? Was there more to the story than he was telling her? What else was he hiding? The nagging questions spiraled in her mind, and each passing day only added to her confusion and doubt. John, for his part, was desperate to fix things. He gave her space, more than he had ever given her before, but he was also constantly hovering, trying to reassure her, offering to tell her everything, to go to the police, to do whatever it took to regain her trust. But Rebecca wasn't ready for any of it. She wasn't sure what she wanted, or even what was right. She needed to understand the full scope of his past, but the more he tried to explain himself, the more her mind recoiled. The truth, as much as she demanded it, felt like an avalanche, waiting to bury them both. It was as if the very foundation of their life together, built on love, family, and years of shared memories, had been cracked open, revealing a dark and terrifying world beneath the surface. Rebecca's instinct screamed at her to walk away, to take their children and leave, to put an end to the life they had shared and run as far away as possible. But there was something inside her, something deep within, that refused to give up on their family, on the years of memories that had bound them together. She couldn't just abandon everything she knew, not yet, not without understanding exactly what she was up against. And that's when the question hit her. How much of the truth had John left out? Was he really telling her everything? Or was there more to his story that he was still keeping hidden, afraid of what it would mean if she discovered the full extent of his past? Rebecca had to confront John. She had to find out the truth for herself, for their children, and for the future she had once believed they shared. There was no more avoiding it. The time had come to dig deeper. One evening, after the children had gone to bed, Rebecca made up her mind. She called John into the living room. He looked hesitant as he stepped through the door, his expression full of both concern and weariness. It was the look of a man who had spent days treading on eggshells, not knowing if he would ever get his family back. But Rebecca didn't care about his guilt or sorrow anymore. She needed answers. The time for vague reassurances and half-truths was over. "John," she began, her voice tight, "I need you to be completely honest with me. No more lies. No more hiding. I want to know everything." John's eyes widened, a flicker of fear passing through his expression. He swallowed hard before sitting down across from her. His face was pale, and his hands rested on his knees, his fingers fidgeting nervously. "I'm telling you everything, Rebecca," he said quietly. "I swear I am. I know I've failed you, but I'll make this right. I'll do whatever it takes." Rebecca leaned forward, the weight of her words heavy. "You're still not telling me everything. There's more to it. I can feel it. I need to know why you ran. I need to know what you did and why. I can't move forward with you until I have the full picture." John shifted uncomfortably, avoiding her gaze. He opened his mouth, but then closed it, as if struggling to find the words. The silence stretched, thick and unbearable. Rebecca could feel the tension building in the room, like a storm about to break. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, John spoke. "I didn't kill her, Rebecca," he said, his voice a low whisper. "I didn't. But I was involved in things I shouldn't have been. I was young, living a stupid life. I got tangled up with people who weren't exactly law-abiding. That night, the woman was killed, and they thought I did it. I didn't have an alibi. I ran because I was terrified. I thought they would arrest me. I thought they would believe I was guilty." Rebecca listened intently, her mind racing with the implications of his words. "Who were you involved with, John? Who were these people?" John hesitated again, his hands clenching into fists. I don't want to drag you into this. You wouldn't understand. I was just trying to survive. I didn't want to get caught up in something I couldn't get out of." Rebecca's frustration bubbled to the surface. She stood up abruptly, pacing in front of him. "You're still hiding something. You're not telling me the full story. You can't keep playing these games with me, John. I need to know what you did, what kind of person you were back then. Because right now, I don't recognize you. I don't know who you are anymore." John's face darkened as he looked down at the floor. "I told you, Rebecca. I didn't kill anyone. But I was part of something. I was running with the wrong crowd, people who had no problem with doing bad things. And when the murder happened, I panicked. I ran to avoid being caught in something I didn't understand." His voice trembled as he spoke, the guilt and fear in his eyes unmistakable. "I'm not proud of it, but it's the truth. I ran because I thought it was the only way to survive." Rebecca was silent for a long moment, digesting his words. She wanted to scream at him, to demand more answers, to tear him apart for all the things he had hidden from her. But there was something in his eyes, a vulnerability, a sense of shame, that made her pause. This man, who had once seemed so calm, so composed, was now a shadow of himself, and she realized that maybe, just maybe, there was more to his story than she had initially thought. "Why didn't you ever tell me about this?" Rebecca asked, her voice softer now. Why keep this secret from me all these years? I deserve to know who I was really married to, John. John's eyes filled with remorse. I was ashamed, Rebecca. I didn't want to be the man I used to be. I wanted to be someone better for you, for our family. I thought if I could bury my past, if I could pretend it never happened, then we could have the life I always dreamed of. A normal life. A happy life. Rebecca stared at him, her mind grappling with the weight of his confession. She had always believed that their marriage was based on honesty, on trust, but now she wondered if any of that was real. John had lived a life of deception, hiding not just his past, but the very essence of who he was. And now, as the truth came spilling out, she could feel the enormity of the deception crashing down on her. So, what happens now? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. What do we do with this? Can we even move forward after all this? John stood up and took a step toward her, his expression earnest. I don't know, Rebecca. I don't know if I deserve your forgiveness, but I'll do whatever it takes to make this right. I love you. I love our family, and I've never wanted to lose you. Please, give me a chance to prove that I'm not the same person I was then. Rebecca felt a pang in her chest, torn between the man she had once loved and the stranger standing before her now. She wanted to believe him, wanted to believe that he could change, that the man she had built a life with was still in there somewhere. But the pain of his betrayal was too fresh, too raw. She didn't know if she could ever look at him the same way again. For the first time in their relationship, Rebecca didn't know what to do. She didn't know if she should walk away, take the children, and leave this life behind, or if she should try to rebuild, to forgive him for the secrets he had kept hidden for so long. Could she learn to trust him again? Could their marriage survive this storm? Or was it already too late? The answers weren't clear, and they wouldn't come easily. But one thing was certain. Rebecca was no longer the woman she had been before. She had seen the darkness lurking beneath the surface of their perfect life, and now, there was no turning back. Rebecca's life had become an emotional battlefield. The days following John's confession were a blur of confusion, heartache, and emotional turmoil. It had been difficult to make sense of everything she had learned, but even more difficult to figure out what came next. The world she had known, a world where she and John shared a quiet, unspoken trust, had been shattered beyond recognition. The lines between who John had been and who he was now seemed blurry and distant, and Rebecca struggled to navigate the unfamiliar terrain of her emotions. She had never imagined she'd be in a position like this, forced to confront the past of the man she had spent over a decade loving, the man who had, until now, seemed so perfect in her eyes. John had begged for forgiveness, assuring her that he was no longer the man he had been, that he had changed, that he was ready to prove it. But every time Rebecca looked at him, she was reminded of the lies, the years of deception. Every smile they shared, every loving glance, felt somehow tainted by the shadows of his past. She didn't know whether to trust him again, or if she even wanted to. Could their marriage, their family, survive the weight of what he had concealed for so long? The tension in their home was palpable. John's presence, once comforting, now felt like a constant reminder of betrayal. The warmth of their love had been replaced with cold uncertainty. He tried his best to make amends. He was attentive, apologetic, and willing to do whatever it took to make her feel safe again. He even suggested therapy, convinced that speaking to someone might help them rebuild their broken trust. But Rebecca was not ready for any of that. She wasn't sure how to begin the healing process, and worse, she wasn't sure if she could forgive him, even if she tried. There were moments when Rebecca caught herself remembering the good times, the quiet evenings they spent watching movies together, the way he held her hand on long drives, the feeling of his arms around her when she felt insecure. She remembered their first years together, when life had been simple and full of possibilities. She thought of their children, how they had built a life for them, how John had always been the father figure they adored. And yet, all of it felt hollow now. How could she reconcile those memories with the man who had hidden his criminal past from her? How could she hold on to those moments when they felt so inseparable from the lies? The weight of her decision hung over her every day. Should she forgive him and try to rebuild their life together? Could they overcome this fracture in their relationship? Or was it a wound that would never heal, a crack too deep to repair? Every thought Rebecca had seemed to circle back to the same question. Who was John now? And was he still the man she had married? The first weeks after the confrontation were filled with silent arguments, moments of forced politeness, and long stretches of time where neither of them knew what to say. They lived in the same house, but their connection was fractured, their conversations distant and guarded. Rebecca found herself constantly overthinking their interactions. Was he telling the truth now? Was he hiding something else? Or was he genuinely trying to change to make things right? She couldn't even tell anymore. Every time she caught him staring off into space or acting overly protective, she couldn't help but wonder if it was a sign of guilt or fear, perhaps of her leaving, perhaps of his past catching up with him again. In those first few weeks, Rebecca struggled with a feeling she had never experienced before: vulnerability. For so long, she had been the strong one in their relationship, the person who held everything together. John had always been the protector, the one she leaned on when life got tough. But now, she felt like the fragile one, walking on eggshells, unsure if the ground beneath her would crack open and swallow her whole. She had always trusted John with her heart, her life, and now it seemed like the very core of her being was unraveling. There were moments when Rebecca felt as if she was sinking, trapped in a sea of doubt and fear. She started to question everything she knew about herself, about their relationship. Who was she, if not the wife of a man who had lied to her for so long? Who was she if she couldn't trust the person closest to her? And could she ever trust him again? It felt as though the more she tried to understand John's past, the more she lost herself in the process. There was a part of her that wanted to run away from it all, to escape from the suffocating grip of this painful reality. But there were also moments, fleeting though they were, when she saw a glimpse of the man she had fallen in love with, a man who was truly sorry for what he had done, who wanted to make things right, who wanted to repair the damage and build a future together. She wanted to believe in him, in them.
But could she?
The emotional toll began to wear on Rebecca's mind and body. She found herself losing sleep, her thoughts racing through the night as she struggled to make sense of it all. She felt like a stranger in her own home, as though the walls were closing in around her, suffocating her with the pressure of her unresolved feelings. She began to withdraw from her friends and family, not knowing how to explain what was happening at home. She couldn't find the words to explain the confusion, the anxiety, the sense of betrayal that was slowly eating away at her. And when she did speak to her loved ones, she found herself telling them only part of the story. She couldn't share the full extent of the pain, the way John's past had made her feel, because it seemed impossible to articulate. Despite the turmoil, Rebecca did her best to maintain normalcy for their children. She knew she couldn't let them see the cracks forming in their family. They were too young to understand the complexities of adult relationships, and she didn't want them to be affected by her personal struggles. But even in her attempts to keep things together, she noticed how tense the atmosphere had become at home. The children picked up on the subtle shifts, sensing that something was off. They noticed the silence at the dinner table, the way Rebecca and John didn't laugh the way they used to, the way Rebecca sometimes seemed distant, lost in thought. They began asking questions, innocent ones, questions they couldn't possibly understand, and Rebecca found herself struggling to answer them without revealing too much. John, for his part, became more and more desperate. He tried everything to rebuild their relationship. He insisted on going to counseling. He suggested they take a trip to try to reconnect. He even made an effort to be more present and involved with the children. But nothing seemed to be enough. Rebecca's heart had been shattered, and no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't piece it back together. She had once believed that their love could withstand anything, but now it felt fragile, like a broken mirror that had been hastily glued back together, the cracks too visible to ignore. As time passed, Rebecca began to feel the burden of the decision she had to make. It was as if her life had become a constant tug-of-war between her desire for the life she had known and her fear that she could never go back to it. She began to question her role in this marriage, her ability to forgive, her sense of identity. She wasn't the same person she had been before, and it terrified her. She didn't want to be defined by John's mistakes, but she also didn't know if she could simply let them go. There was a part of her that wanted to fight for their family, to fight for the life they had built together. But there was another part of her that knew, deep down, that she couldn't keep pretending that everything was okay. It was during this internal struggle that Rebecca began to feel a shift in herself. She realized that she had been so focused on John's past that she had neglected her own feelings. She had been so consumed with trying to figure out whether she could forgive him, whether they could make their marriage work, that she hadn't stopped to ask herself what she truly wanted. What did she need to feel whole again? What did she need to heal? Rebecca began to spend more time alone, going for long walks, journaling her thoughts, and reflecting on her own emotions. Slowly, she started to understand that forgiveness wasn't about excusing John's past. It was about freeing herself from the hold it had on her. She realized that in order to move forward, she had to let go of the bitterness, the hurt, and the fear that had consumed her. But that didn't mean she had to forget what had happened. It meant finding a way to accept the reality of the situation and decide what kind of future she wanted to create for herself and for her family. One evening, as she sat on the porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon, Rebecca made a decision. She wasn't going to let this define her. She wasn't going to let it control her future. Whether she stayed with John or left, the choice would be hers. She would no longer be a victim of the past. She would move forward on her terms. And so, for the first time in weeks, Rebecca felt a small sense of peace. She hadn't solved everything yet, but she had taken the first step in reclaiming her own agency. The road ahead was uncertain, but she no longer felt paralyzed by fear. She could face the truth, and she could decide what came next. In the weeks that followed Rebecca's emotional reckoning, there was a sense of resolution that started to take shape. She had made up her mind. She would try to forgive John, though it wasn't going to be easy. She wasn't ready to give up on everything they had built together, not yet. She owed it to their children, to their life, to at least attempt to rebuild the trust that had been shattered. But as she approached this decision, Rebecca could feel the weight of the choice pressing down on her. She wasn't just deciding whether to stay with John. She was also deciding whether she could ever truly trust him again. John, for his part, had seemed to accept that their relationship would never be the same. He had spent the last few weeks walking on eggshells, desperate to prove to Rebecca that he was worthy of her trust. He stopped drinking, started attending therapy, and volunteered to go to marriage counseling with her. He was trying, there was no question about that. But as the days went by, Rebecca couldn't help but feel that something was missing. Even though John was more present and attentive, something in their relationship still felt off. He was trying to be the man she needed, but it felt like he was doing so out of guilt, not out of a natural, authentic desire to change. And despite her best efforts, Rebecca couldn't help but feel like she was being forced into a role she didn't want to play, his savior, his redeemer, the one who had to choose to forgive him and bring their family back together. Their relationship, though fragile, began to take on a sense of normalcy, at least on the surface. They resumed their routines, the children went back to school, and they attended social events like they had before. The cracks in their relationship were well hidden beneath layers of polite conversation and forced smiles. To the outside world, they were still a family, still living their perfect, happy life. But Rebecca knew better. She could feel the tension in the air every time they sat together at dinner, every time they tried to have a conversation without it spiraling into uncomfortable silence or awkwardness. John's past was still there, looming over them, a constant shadow that neither of them could escape. There were moments when Rebecca convinced herself that things were getting better. There were small victories that made her believe they could make it through this. Victories that came in the form of shared laughter, fleeting moments of tenderness, and the quiet intimacy of shared memories. John was trying to be the man he once was, but each time he looked at her, there was a hint of desperation in his eyes. He wanted to be forgiven, he wanted to prove himself, and she could see the weight of his remorse pressing on him. And perhaps it was this that made her second-guess herself. Was she overthinking things? Was she really being too hard on him, expecting too much? After all, he had confessed. He had admitted his mistakes, and now he was trying to make amends. Wasn't that enough? One day, as they sat on the couch after putting the kids to bed, John took her hand and looked at her earnestly. His voice was soft, filled with emotion. "Rebecca, I know I've hurt you. I know that what I've done is unforgivable, but I'm asking you to trust me again, to give me the chance to prove that I'm a better person now. I know it's not going to be easy, but I believe we can get through this. We've been through so much together already. Please, just give me the chance to make it right." Rebecca looked at him for a long moment, her heart heavy with the weight of his words. The hope in his eyes was so raw, so genuine, that for a fleeting moment, she almost felt herself beginning to soften. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to trust him. She wanted to feel like the woman she had been before all this, before the lies, before the betrayal. But deep inside, she knew that nothing would ever be the same again. The knowledge of what John had done, what he had hidden from her for so long, would forever change the way she saw him. And though she had promised herself she would try to rebuild, to forgive, a part of her knew she might never truly be able to. But she didn't voice this doubt. Not yet. She couldn't bear the thought of ending it all, of throwing away everything they had worked for. And so, in that moment, she said the words that would set the course for the next chapter of their lives. "I'll try, John," she whispered. "I'll try to trust you again. I'll try to forgive you." John's face lit up with a mixture of relief and gratitude. "Thank you, Rebecca," he said, his voice choked with emotion. "You don't know what this means to me. I swear to you, I'll do whatever it takes. I'll prove to you that I'm worthy of your love. I'll spend the rest of my life making it up to you." For a moment, Rebecca almost believed him. She almost thought that this was the beginning of their recovery, the moment when they would heal and move forward together, stronger than before. But even as the words left her mouth, a nagging voice in the back of her mind told her that she might be making a huge mistake. She was giving him the benefit of the doubt, perhaps too much. She was accepting a version of John that she could never unsee, one that was now forever marked by the truth of his past. The days that followed were a blur of emotional ups and downs. Rebecca tried to stay focused on the task at hand, rebuilding her trust in John, rebuilding their family. But the cracks in their relationship were still there, always visible, no matter how hard they tried to cover them up. It was clear to Rebecca that while John was trying his best, he was not the man he had once been. And neither was she. Their marriage had been irreparably changed, and no amount of therapy, no amount of apologies, could erase the damage that had been done. Rebecca found herself questioning her own motives. Was she staying with John because she truly believed they could be happy again? Or was she doing it out of fear? Fear of being alone, fear of breaking up the family, fear of losing everything she had worked so hard to build? She didn't want to admit it, but the latter seemed to be closer to the truth. She was afraid of the unknown, afraid of the chaos that might follow if she chose to leave. The familiar discomfort of their relationship, painful as it was, felt safer than the uncertainty of a future without him. But deep inside, Rebecca knew that her decision to stay wasn't as much about her love for John as it was about a desire to avoid facing the harsh realities of the situation. She wasn't truly ready to confront the idea that she might be trapped in a marriage with a man whose past she couldn't escape. And so, despite all the signs that told her otherwise, she kept pushing forward, kept pretending that everything was fine. Her false sense of victory didn't last long. There were moments, as they went through the motions of their normal life, when the weight of their situation would crash down on her. It was during these moments, when John was absent for long stretches of time at work, when they sat in silence during meals, when she found herself staring at their wedding photos, that Rebecca felt the deepest sense of loss. She had once felt secure in her love for him, in the life they had built. But now, she could no longer see a future with him without the lingering shadow of his past. The turning point came one afternoon when Rebecca found herself at a crossroads. John had been distant for the past few days, preoccupied with work and the stresses of his own emotional baggage. They hadn't had a conversation in days, one that didn't feel forced or uncomfortable, and she was left alone with her thoughts, staring out the window, wondering if she had made the right decision. As she looked at her reflection in the glass, something clicked. She realized that in her quest to make things work, she had lost sight of herself. She had become so consumed by the desire to fix their broken relationship that she had stopped asking herself what she truly needed. She had convinced herself that she could rebuild what had been shattered, but the reality was that some things were beyond repair. She had wanted to believe that she could heal the wound, that they could go back to the way things were, but she realized now that it was a false hope, a dream that could never be realized. The truth hit her like a ton of bricks. She had been clinging to the idea of a false victory, the belief that things would somehow go back to normal. But in her heart, she knew that nothing would ever be the same again. The love she had for John, though still there in some ways, was tainted by his past, by the years of lies, and by the trauma of betrayal. And no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't forget that truth. It would follow her forever. As the reality of her situation settled in, Rebecca knew she had to make a decision. Not for John, not for the children, but for herself. The false victory she had so desperately clung to was no longer enough. The time had come to face the truth, and whatever came next, she would face it on her own terms. The decision to stay in the marriage, despite the weight of John's past, was beginning to unravel in ways Rebecca hadn't anticipated. She had tried to convince herself that forgiveness was a step toward healing, that allowing John back into her life would eventually erase the shadows of his past crimes. She believed that she could return to a life of normalcy, where they could be happy again, even if things were different. But deep down, she knew something wasn't right. What she had hoped would be a gradual rebuilding process was becoming a rapid descent into an emotional quagmire, one that she couldn't escape. John was still trying. He still came to her with his apologies, his attempts to prove he had changed, his quiet promises to be a better man. But the more he worked to make things right, the more Rebecca felt her own resentment growing. She could no longer ignore the truth that had been gnawing at her for weeks. Forgiveness had come too easily. She had not only forgiven him, but had sacrificed her own well-being in the process. She had convinced herself that by accepting him, she could patch over the cracks in their relationship, but now the cracks were spreading, widening, impossible to ignore. The emotional toll of this false peace was immense. Every day, Rebecca felt as if she were playing a role, an actor in her own life. The truth was that she wasn't ready to forgive him, not in the way she had hoped. Her wounds were too deep, her trust too shattered. And no amount of John's contrition, no amount of apologies or promises, could erase the pain she felt in her chest when she looked at him. She had told herself that forgiveness would come in time, that love would be enough, but instead, all she felt was the quiet ache of betrayal that had taken root in her heart. Rebecca started to question her own choices. Had she made the right decision by staying? Had she given in too quickly to the idea of reconciliation, too easily convinced herself that time would heal everything? Every morning, when she looked in the mirror, she saw the tiredness in her eyes, the deep lines that had crept in since the confrontation. She hadn't been sleeping well for months, her mind racing at night with memories of the past, of John's confession, of the days when she had believed in the illusion of their perfect life. She had told herself that she could handle the truth, that she could bear the weight of John's mistakes, but now she was seeing the cost of that choice, an immense emotional cost that she couldn't ignore any longer. It was clear now that staying with John wasn't the simple answer she had hoped it would be. As the days turned into weeks, Rebecca found herself becoming increasingly withdrawn. Her sense of isolation deepened, as did the ache in her chest. The loneliness she felt wasn't just because of the emotional distance between her and John. It was the quiet realization that the life she had dreamed of was slipping through her fingers. She had chosen to stay in the relationship, yes, but she was losing herself in the process. One afternoon, while John was at work, Rebecca sat in the living room, staring at the old family photos that lined the walls. The pictures captured moments of joy, milestones they had shared together, their wedding day, the births of their children, the vacations they had taken as a family. But now, each image felt like a painful reminder of a life that was no longer hers. She had once looked at those photos and felt proud of the life they had built. Now, They only made her feel hollow. The person she had been in those moments, the woman who believed in unconditional love, in a future that was safe and unbreakable, was gone. She had replaced that woman with someone more cautious, more fearful, more aware of the fragility of happiness. Rebecca's mind wandered back to that night, when she had found the newspaper clipping, when she had confronted John. She remembered the gut-wrenching horror she had felt when she realized that the man she had spent years with had been implicated in a crime so vile, so inexplicable. John had sworn that it was a mistake, that he had been young and reckless, and that he had left that life behind. And for a moment, Rebecca had wanted to believe him. She had wanted to believe in the man she had married, the father of her children, the person who had stood beside her through thick and thin. But now, in the quiet of her own thoughts, she couldn't help but wonder if she had been too naive, too willing to forgive. As she sat in the living room, tears started to well up in her eyes. She couldn't deny it anymore. She had paid a heavy price for this illusion of reconciliation. She had given up pieces of herself, her trust, her sense of security, her happiness, in the hope that things would go back to the way they were. But they hadn't. And now, she was left with the wreckage of her own choices. Rebecca's body ached with exhaustion, her muscles tense from the constant emotional strain. She hadn't been able to talk to anyone about what she was going through. She hadn't confided in her friends, her family, or even her therapist. The idea of telling someone the truth, that she wasn't sure if she could live with John anymore, felt like a betrayal in itself. She had promised herself she would stay. She had promised herself she would try to forgive him. To admit to anyone, especially herself, that she was struggling felt like a failure, a sign that she had given up too easily, that she hadn't tried hard enough. The guilt was suffocating. She had allowed herself to believe that by staying, she was somehow making the right decision, somehow helping her children, helping John, helping herself. But the truth was becoming undeniable. Staying with John had only deepened her sense of loss. She wasn't moving forward. She was simply existing in a state of suspended animation, waiting for something to change that never would. The past had a way of sticking with her, of infiltrating every corner of her life, no matter how hard she tried to ignore it. One evening, as John came home from work, he noticed the distant look in Rebecca's eyes. He had been trying so hard, so desperately, to make things right, but he could feel the distance between them growing, widening with each passing day. He knew something was wrong, but he didn't know how to fix it. When he sat beside her on the couch and asked if she was okay, Rebecca finally found herself breaking down. The walls she had built around herself crumbled, and she allowed herself to speak the words that had been lodged in her throat for so long. "I can't do this anymore, John," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I can't pretend that everything is fine. I'm not okay. I'm not okay with you. I'm not okay with the lies. I've been lying to myself. I thought I could forgive you. I thought I could move past this, but I can't. I can't forgive you, and I can't keep pretending like everything is okay." John's face twisted with a mixture of confusion and fear. He had been so sure that if he just tried hard enough, if he kept apologizing, if he kept working to be a better man, Rebecca would eventually come around. But her words struck him like a physical blow. He hadn't expected this. "Rebecca, please," he began, reaching out to touch her arm, but she pulled away.
No, John.
I can't keep living like this," she continued, tears streaming down her face. "I've lost myself in all of this. I've given so much of myself to this, to you, to the idea of what we were, that I've forgotten who I am. I thought staying would be enough. I thought forgiving you would be enough. But it isn't. I can't live like this anymore." John sat in stunned silence, the words hanging in the air between them like a weight neither of them could lift. He had thought that by giving her time, by giving her space to heal, everything would eventually go back to the way it was. He had thought that if he just kept trying, they would be able to move past this. But he had underestimated the depth of Rebecca's pain, the depth of the emotional cost that had come with his past. Rebecca had paid the price for staying in a marriage that no longer made sense. She had sacrificed her peace of mind, her happiness, and her sense of self in the hope that things would magically improve. But now she realized that the cost had been too high. She couldn't undo the years of deceit, and she couldn't ignore the truth anymore. Staying in this marriage was costing her far more than she was willing to pay. And the longer she stayed, the harder it would be to get out. Rebecca stood at the window, her arms wrapped around herself, gazing out into the quiet night. The streetlights cast long shadows across the driveway, illuminating the path to their front door. It was a cold, crisp evening, but it wasn't the weather that made her feel cold. It was the quiet finality of her decision. It had taken weeks of emotional turmoil, countless sleepless nights, and an agonizing journey through her own fears and doubts, but she had finally come to a point where she couldn't ignore the truth any longer. The man she had married, the man she had built her life around, was someone she could no longer trust. And though the decision to leave him was the hardest thing she had ever done, it was the right one. John had left the house that evening, his bags packed, his words still hanging in the air between them. She had told him, firmly but gently, that their marriage was over. The silence in the room had been suffocating as he gathered his things. She had thought he would protest, would beg her to reconsider. But instead, he had looked at her with empty eyes and nodded. There was no anger, no pleading, just resignation. He knew, deep down, that their relationship had reached an irreparable breaking point. He had tried. He had begged for forgiveness, done everything in his power to prove that he had changed. But the truth had come too late. Rebecca's trust, once broken, could never be restored to its former place. Her mind replayed the events of the past few months, the confrontation with John, the discovery of his past, the seemingly endless cycle of regret and apology. She had tried so hard to rebuild, to piece together something that resembled the life they once shared. She had given him chance after chance, hoping that the man she thought she knew would reemerge. But the more she tried to forgive, the more she realized that forgiveness alone wasn't enough. What she needed wasn't just forgiveness from John, it was forgiveness from herself. She had been so consumed with trying to make their marriage work that she had forgotten to take care of herself, to acknowledge the damage that had been done to her own soul. The weeks that followed their separation were a blur of mixed emotions. There were moments of clarity when she realized that she had made the right choice, that her decision to leave was an act of self-preservation. There were also moments of doubt, when the quiet loneliness of her empty house seemed unbearable. She had not anticipated how much she would grieve, not just the loss of John, but the loss of the woman she had once been. She had been so sure, so confident in her ability to forgive, that she hadn't allowed herself to acknowledge the toll it had taken on her. Now, with the weight of the truth finally settling in, she had to face herself, truly face herself, for the first time in years. The first days after John's departure were the hardest. Rebecca found herself adrift in a sea of unfamiliar emotions. She felt an overwhelming sense of freedom, but it was tinged with sadness. The house felt quieter without him, and yet, in some ways, it felt more like her own. She could breathe again, without the constant weight of his presence in the background. But there was also the emptiness, the absence of the life they had built together. For so long, their home had been a place of shared memories, of laughter, of love. Now, it was a place where all of that felt like a distant echo. She had not just lost John, she had lost the version of herself that existed within that life. In the weeks following the breakup, Rebecca sought solace in her friends and family. She had been hesitant to confide in them during the turmoil of the previous months, afraid of being judged, of being seen as weak. But now, as she processed her emotions, she realized that she needed them more than ever. They had watched her struggle, had seen the change in her. Her mother, in particular, had always been there to offer a steady, reassuring presence. But it was her closest friends who truly understood the depth of her pain. They had witnessed the unraveling of her relationship with John from the outside, and now they saw the courage it took for her to walk away. Rebecca found herself sharing more than she ever had before, opening up about her fears, her doubts, the suffocating weight of trying to forgive someone who had broken her heart. She spoke of the guilt she felt, of the overwhelming fear of being alone, of the uncertainty of her future. But she also spoke of the sense of empowerment that had come with her decision to leave. She had chosen herself. For the first time in years, she had put her own needs first. It was during one of these conversations with her mother that Rebecca came to a profound realization. Sitting across from her at the kitchen table, her mother gently took her hand and said, "Rebecca, you've been so focused on what John did to you that you've forgotten to look at what you did for yourself. You fought for your family, you fought for your marriage, you tried to make things work when everything around you was falling apart. But now, you need to fight for you. You need to reclaim who you are." Rebecca looked at her mother, tears filling her eyes. She hadn't realized it until that moment, but her mother was right. In her effort to save her marriage, she had lost sight of the woman she had been before John, before the children, before the weight of everyone else's needs. She had spent so many years playing the role of a devoted wife and mother that she had forgotten what it felt like to be her own person, to live for herself. The following weeks were a journey of rediscovery. Rebecca began to slowly rebuild her life, not around her identity as John's wife or the mother of their children, but as a woman on her own, with her own hopes, dreams, and desires. She started writing again, something she hadn't done in years. It was a form of therapy, a way for her to process the storm of emotions that had been raging inside her. Her journal became her sanctuary, a place where she could speak freely about her pain, her confusion, her anger, but also her hope. She wrote about the woman she wanted to become, the woman she knew was still inside her, buried beneath the layers of self-doubt and regret. Rebecca also began to take time for herself, taking walks in the park, going to yoga classes, even taking a weekend trip alone to the mountains. She had been so consumed by the needs of others for so long that she had forgotten how to enjoy the simple pleasures of life. Slowly but surely, she was reclaiming the pieces of herself that had been lost. She started to feel like the person she had once been, the woman who had dreams, who had passions, who wasn't defined by her past mistakes or the mistakes of others. As Rebecca began to heal, she also began to accept that healing was a messy, imperfect process. There were days when she felt as if the weight of everything would crush her, when the loneliness of her new reality felt unbearable. But there were also moments of clarity, moments when she realized just how far she had come. She wasn't the woman who had ignored the warning signs, who had overlooked the truth in order to preserve her marriage. She was someone who had faced the truth, no matter how painful, and had chosen to step into the unknown, armed with the knowledge that she was stronger than she had ever believed. A few months after the separation, Rebecca found herself sitting in a cafe with her closest friend, Sarah. They were having coffee and chatting about life, about the challenges and joys of being single again, about the new directions their lives were taking. Rebecca had just started a new job, a career she had always dreamed of, but had put on hold for years in favor of raising her children. As they laughed together, Rebecca felt something she hadn't felt in a long time, a sense of contentment, of peace. "I'm proud of you, Rebecca," Sarah said, her voice full of admiration. "You've really come a long way." Rebecca smiled softly, her eyes reflecting a quiet strength. "I'm proud of myself, too," she said, the words feeling like a revelation. "I didn't think I could do it, but I did. I'm still here, and I'm still me, and I'm learning how to be okay with that." As Rebecca looked out the window, watching the bustle of the city outside, she knew that she had come full circle. She had faced the truth of her marriage and the truth of herself. She had paid a heavy price for her illusions and her mistakes, but she had emerged from it with a new understanding, a new sense of clarity. She wasn't the woman she had been when she married John. She wasn't the woman she had been when she found out the truth about his past. But she was still a woman with a future, one that was hers to shape, one that was filled with possibilities. Rebecca knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be moments of doubt, moments of fear, but she was no longer afraid to walk it alone. She had learned the most important lesson of all. Sometimes, the only way to find yourself is to lose everything else. And now, with the truth in her heart, she was ready to move forward, stronger than she had ever been before.
Disclaimer: this channel does not support or tolerate any form of discrimination, racism,
prejudice, or violation of human rights. The stories presented here are original and created by the author with the aim of promoting reflection, awareness, and dialogue. All content is developed with respect for diversity and the dignity of all people.